September 1944. The forests of eastern France were thick with morning fog, the kind that clung to everything and made soldiers feel like ghosts wandering through a world that had forgotten them. Second Lieutenant Leonard Hartwell of the United States Army crouched behind a crumbling stone wall, his breath visible in the cold air, watching the German-held village of Saint-Étienne-du-Bois through battered field binoculars. What he saw made his stomach drop. The village was fortified, heavily fortified. Machine positions at the church tower, defensive barriers across every road, and what appeared to be at least 200 German soldiers dug into positions that would have required an entire battalion to assault properly. Leonard had exactly 37 men under his command, most of them exhausted from 3 weeks of continuous operations, low on ammunition, and spread across nearly half a mile of forest. His radio man, Corporal Eddie Marchetti from Brooklyn, crawled up beside him and whispered what everyone already knew. "Lieutenant, we're not taking that village. Not with what we've got." Leonard didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing through possibilities, calculating odds, remembering everything he had learned about the German military mindset during his training back in the States. He thought about his father, a traveling salesman from Ohio, who had taught him that sometimes the best way to close a deal was to make the other person believe they had no choice at all. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened over the next 6 hours would become one of the most audacious bluffs in military history. A moment when one young officer's understanding of human psychology would accomplish what superior firepower could not. This is the true story of how Leonard Hartwell convinced 200 German soldiers to surrender without firing a single shot, and how his men went from thinking their lieutenant had completely lost his mind to witnessing something they would tell their grandchildren about for decades to come. To understand how Leonard Hartwell ended up in that fog-shrouded forest, we need to go back 18 months to a small town called Millbrook in central Ohio. Leonard was 23 years old in early 1943, the son of Harold Hartwell, whose territory as a salesman covered 6 counties and who had never met a skeptical customer he couldn't eventually win over. Young Leonard had grown up watching his father work, learning the subtle art of reading people, understanding their fears and desires, and knowing exactly when to push and when to pull back. "Selling isn't about the product, son," Harold used to say during those long drives between farm towns. "It's about making the other fella believe that saying yes is the only sensible thing to do. You don't argue him into it. You arrange things so that no becomes impossible." Leonard had been studying engineering at Ohio State University when the call came to serve his country. He enlisted in May of 1943 and was selected for Officer Candidate School based on his test scores and what his evaluators described as an unusual ability to remain calm under pressure. His training took him through the standard curriculum of tactics, weapons handling, and small unit leadership. But it was the psychological lectures that truly captured his attention. He learned about German military culture, the rigid hierarchy, the emphasis on following orders from superiors, and the deep psychological impact of being cut off from communication with higher command. He learned that German soldiers were trained to function as parts of a larger machine, and that when that machine broke down, many soldiers experienced a kind of paralysis. Leonard filed this information away, never imagining how crucially it would serve him in the forests of France. He arrived in Normandy in July of 1944, 3 weeks after the initial landings. The beaches had been secured, but the hedgerow country inland was proving difficult. Leonard's first taste of real conflict came near the town of St. Lô. He lost 4 men in his first week, good men who had trusted him and followed his orders. The weight of those losses settled onto his shoulders like a physical burden. He swore to himself that he would never waste another life unnecessarily, that he would find ways to accomplish his objectives without feeding his soldiers into the machinery of destruction. By September, Leonard's unit had pushed deep into eastern France as part of the Allied advance. The German forces were in general retreat, but pockets of resistance remained. Command had identified Saint-Étienne-du-Bois as a strategically important crossroads that needed to be secured before the main force could continue its advance. The orders seemed simple enough: take the village. What the orders failed to account for was the fact that the German garrison at Saint-Étienne had been reinforced 2 days earlier. by soldiers retreating from other positions, and that what should have been a lightly defended objective was now a substantial defensive position. Leonard's reconnaissance revealed the full scope of the problem. 200 German soldiers, perhaps more, well supplied and dug in. His own force numbered 37 men, many of them carrying less than 50 rounds of ammunition each. A frontal assault would be disastrous. Waiting for reinforcements could take days, and the village commanded the road that the Allied supply convoys needed. "What are you thinking, Lieutenant?" asked Sergeant Thomas Whitmore, a 32-year-old career soldier from Georgia who had been in uniform since 1939 and had seen more of this conflict than anyone else in the unit. Leonard lowered his binoculars and was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. "Sergeant, I'm thinking about my father." Whitmore's eyebrows rose. "Sir?" "My father was a salesman, best in his territory. You know what he always said? He said that when you can't outgun somebody, you have to outthink them. And when you can't outthink them, you have to make them outthink themselves." "I'm not sure I follow, Lieutenant." Leonard smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Whitmore distinctly uneasy. "Sergeant, how many jeeps do we have?" "3, sir, all in working order." "And how many different directions can we approach this village from?" Whitmore considered the terrain. 4, maybe 5 if you count the ravine to the south. "Perfect. Here's what we're going to do." What Leonard outlined over the next 30 minutes sounded to his men like the plan of someone who had completely lost touch with reality. Corporal Marchetti actually asked if the lieutenant was feeling ill. Private First Class Samuel Okonkwo, a 20-year-old from Chicago who had lied about his age to enlist, laughed out loud before realizing that Leonard was completely serious. But Sergeant Whitmore listened carefully, and as he listened, something began to shift in his expression. What Lieutenant Hartwell was proposing was unconventional, but there was a logic to it, an understanding of the enemy's psychology that went beyond anything Whitmore had encountered before. "It might work," Whitmore said slowly when Leonard had finished. "It's insane, but it might work. The alternative is a direct assault that will get most of us hurt," Leonard replied. "I'm not willing to do that, not when there's another way." The plan hinged on 3 elements. First, making the German garrison believe they were surrounded by a much larger force. Second, cutting off their communication with higher command to create isolation and confusion. Third, presenting surrender as not just an option, but as the only rational choice. Leonard divided his 37 men into 5 groups, each with specific assignments. The 3 jeeps would circle the village continuously, taking different routes, creating engine noise from multiple directions. Half of his soldiers would spread out through the forest and create as much activity as possible, moving between positions, calling out fake orders to non-existent units. The technical execution required precise timing. Each jeep would complete a circuit every 12 minutes, staggered so that engine sounds reached the village from different directions every 4 minutes. The soldiers in the forest would rotate positions every 15 minutes, always moving, always creating the impression of fresh troops arriving. "What about their radio?" asked Private First Class Angela Morrison, one of the communications specialists attached to Leonard's unit. She was 22, from Seattle, and had one of the quickest minds Leonard had ever encountered. "That's where you come in," Leonard said. "I need you to jam their frequencies. Can you do that with our equipment?" Morrison considered. "I can create enough interference to make communication difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. Might buy us a few hours." "A few hours is all I need." The operation began at 1100 hours. Leonard sent his first jeep on its circuit, engine deliberately racing to maximize noise. Simultaneously, the soldiers in the forest began their performance, shouting orders, crashing through underbrush, creating the impression of a large force moving into position. From inside the village, the effect was immediate and disorienting. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, the officer commanding the German garrison, heard the engine sounds approaching from the west and immediately ordered his men to defensive positions. Before they were fully set, another engine sound came from the north, then the east, then what sounded like infantry moving through the forest to the south. Richter was a professional soldier, 41 years old, who had served since 1932. He was experienced enough to know that something about this situation felt wrong, but he couldn't identify exactly what. He tried to raise his command on the radio, but received only static and fragments of unintelligible transmissions. "How many of them are out there?" he demanded of Feldwebel Werner Brandt, his senior non-commissioned officer. Brandt shook his head. "Impossible to say, Herr Hauptmann. The sounds suggest substantial forces on multiple sides, perhaps a full battalion, maybe more." Richter felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning fog. A full battalion. His 200 men were good soldiers, but they were tired, far from any support. And if the Americans had truly surrounded them with battalion-strength forces, the mathematics were not in their favor. For 2 hours, Leonard maintained the illusion. His men were exhausted, running constantly, making noise, keeping up the pretense of overwhelming force. Morrison reported that she was successfully interfering with German radio communications. At 1300 hours, Leonard decided it was time for the next phase. He had his men cease all movement and noise simultaneously. One moment, the forest was alive with sounds. The next, absolute silence. The effect, he hoped, would be deeply unsettling to the Germans, suggesting a disciplined force that moved and stopped on perfect coordination. He was right. Inside the village, Richter felt his unease deepen. The sudden silence was more frightening than the noise had been. A force that could coordinate so perfectly was not a force of amateurs. This was a professional army, well led and presumably well armed. Leonard gave the silence 20 minutes to work on German nerves. Then he did something that made even Sergeant Whitmore question his sanity. He walked out of the forest, alone and unarmed, hands raised, directly toward the German lines. "Lieutenant, this is insane," Whitmore had protested when Leonard announced his intention. "They won't harm me," Leonard said calmly. "They're scared, confused, and cut off. Right now, they're looking for a way out. I'm going to give them one." He walked slowly across the open field between the forest and the village, every step measured and deliberate. He could feel eyes on him from multiple directions. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest, but he kept his expression calm, his pace unhurried. A German soldier emerged from behind a barrier, weapon raised, shouting at Leonard to halt. Leonard stopped, hands still raised, and called out in the German he had studied during his training. His pronunciation was imperfect, but his message was clear. "I wish to speak with your commanding officer. I come with a message of great importance." There was a long pause. Finally, the soldier made a decision and gestured for Leonard to approach. He was searched thoroughly, and then led to a stone building in the village center where Hauptmann Richter had established his command post. Richter was a tall man with grey at his temples and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much. "You speak German," Richter observed. "Enough to communicate," Leonard replied. "And I have something important to tell you." "Then speak." Leonard took a deep breath. Everything depended on the next few minutes. "Hauptmann, I am Lieutenant Leonard Hartwell of the United States Army. I have been sent to offer you an opportunity that will only be available for a limited time." Richter's expression was unreadable. "Go on." "You are surrounded by elements of the 3rd Armored Division. We have approximately 3,000 troops in position around this village, supported by artillery and with air support on call." Leonard's voice remained calm, matter of fact. "Our commander has authorized me to offer your garrison the opportunity to surrender honorably before we begin our assault." It was a lie, of course, every word of it, but Leonard delivered it with the absolute conviction of someone stating obvious facts, and he watched Richter's face carefully for any sign of disbelief. 3,000 troops, Richter repeated. "Approximately. The exact number is classified, but I can assure you that our force is more than sufficient to overwhelm your position." Leonard paused. "We would prefer to avoid unnecessary casualties on both sides. The outcome of this situation is already determined." Richter was silent for a long moment. Leonard could almost see the calculations happening behind those tired eyes. The engine sounds from multiple directions, the movement in the forest, the radio interference that prevented communication with higher command, the sudden coordinated silence. How do I know you're telling the truth? Richter finally asked. This was the critical moment. Leonard had prepared for it carefully. You don't, he admitted. But consider your situation, Hauptmann. You're isolated, unable to reach your command. You hear our forces on every side. You know that even if you repel an initial assault, reinforcements are only hours away. He leaned forward slightly. And you know what happens to positions that resist after being offered surrender terms. Very few of your men will see their families again. Leonard saw something shift in Richter's expression. Not defeat exactly, but a kind of weary calculation. There's something else, Leonard continued. The soldiers under your command are good men. Professional soldiers following orders. Surrender now and they'll be treated according to proper conventions. They'll receive food, medical attention, and eventually be returned home when this conflict ends. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Your families at home need these men to return. Germany needs them to return. What purpose is served by throwing away their lives in a village that has no strategic significance to the larger situation? Richter stood and walked to the window, staring out at the fog-shrouded streets. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. You're asking me to surrender my garrison to a force I cannot see. I'm asking you to make a rational decision based on the evidence available to you, Leonard replied. You've heard our strength. You've seen our coordination. Your radio equipment has failed you. You have no reinforcements coming. He stood as well. Hauptmann, I'm not asking you to do anything dishonorable. I'm asking you to save the lives of 200 men who trust you to make the right choice. The silence stretched between them. Leonard could hear his own heartbeat, could feel sweat trickling down his back despite the cold. Everything he had built over the past hours came down to this moment. Finally, Richter turned to face him. You give me your word that my men will be treated properly. You have my word as an officer. Another long pause, then Richter nodded slowly. I will need time to speak with my officers, to explain the situation. You have 1 hour, Leonard said. After that I must return to my commander with your answer. He was escorted back to the edge of the village and released. As he walked across the field toward the forest, he forced himself not to run. He disappeared into the trees and immediately collapsed against a trunk, hands shaking. Lieutenant? Sergeant Whitmore appeared beside him. What happened in there? Leonard took several deep breaths before answering. We wait, 1 hour. Then we find out if the bluff worked. The hour that followed was the longest of Leonard's life. He had his men resume their activities, keeping up the illusion, but his mind was entirely focused on that stone building where Richter was presumably meeting with his officers. At 14:45, 15 minutes before the deadline, a white flag appeared at the edge of the village. Then another. Then another. Sergeant Whitmore stared in disbelief. It worked. It actually worked. German soldiers began emerging from their positions, hands raised, weapons placed carefully on the ground. Leonard watched as first a dozen, then 50, then 100 and more filed out of Saint-Étienne-du-Bois. Hauptmann Richter was among the last to emerge. He walked directly to Leonard and formally offered his surrender. 217 men, he said, all that remains of my garrison. They are now your responsibility, Lieutenant. Leonard accepted the surrender with as much dignity as he could muster, while his mind reeled at what had just occurred. His 37 men moved forward to secure the village and organize the prisoners, and he saw the shock on German faces as they realized how badly they had been deceived. One German sergeant, a grizzled veteran who must have been 50 years old, actually laughed when he understood what had happened. 37? He said to one of Leonard's men. We surrendered to 37 soldiers, but there was no anger in his voice. If anything, there was a strange kind of respect. They had been outmaneuvered not by superior firepower, but by superior thinking. The aftermath of the surrender was a logistical challenge. 217 prisoners required food, water, and supervision. When Major William Crawford arrived with reinforcements the following morning, he listened to the full account with an expression that evolved from skepticism to disbelief to something approaching awe. You bluffed 200 Germans into surrendering, Crawford said slowly. With 37 men and 3 jeeps. Yes, sir. Son, that's either the bravest thing I've ever heard of or the most insane. I haven't decided which. Crawford recommended Leonard for the Silver Star. The decoration did eventually come through, though Leonard rarely spoke about it in later years. What he did speak about was the conversation he had with Hauptmann Richter before the German officer was transported to a prisoner holding area. "You lied to me," Richter said, though there was no accusation in his voice. "There were never 3,000 Americans." "No," Leonard admitted, "there weren't. I suspected as much. The sounds, the movements, they were too theatrical." Leonard felt his heart stop. "Then why did you surrender?" Richter stared at the horizon. "Because you gave me a reason to stop. You gave my men a way to survive. You gave me permission to make the choice I wanted to make anyway." He turned to face Leonard directly. "I've been in uniform for 12 years. I've seen what this conflict does to men on both sides. When you walked into my command post, alone and unarmed, and offered me a way to save 200 lives, do you know what I saw?" Leonard shook his head. "I saw someone who understood that courage isn't about fighting to the last man. It's about having the wisdom to know when fighting serves no purpose. You risked your life to give me that choice. The least I could do was take it." The two men stood in silence, and in that moment, despite everything that separated them, there was a connection that transcended uniforms and borders and the madness of global conflict. Leonard returned to Ohio in September of 1945, discharged with honors. He completed his engineering degree and went on to a successful career building bridges and highways across the Midwest. He married his high school sweetheart, Helen, in 1947 and raised 3 children who never tired of hearing their father's story. But Leonard always told the story with a particular emphasis, one that sometimes surprised his listeners. "The point isn't that I was brave," he would say. "The point is that everyone involved was brave. My men were brave for trusting a plan that seemed insane. Richter was brave for choosing to save lives instead of fighting to the end. Even the German soldiers who surrendered were brave, because it takes courage to lay down your weapons and trust that your enemy will treat you fairly." He would pause then, a faraway look in his eyes. The real lesson of that day is that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it looks like charging into danger, and sometimes it looks like walking away from a fight that serves no purpose. The trick is knowing which kind of courage the situation requires. Years later, in 1967, Leonard received an unexpected letter from Germany. It was from Richter's daughter, writing to inform Leonard that her father had passed away peacefully in Munich. Klaus Richter had spoken often of the American lieutenant who had given him the chance to bring his men home. "My father wanted you to know," the daughter wrote, "that he never regretted his decision that day. He said you gave him permission to choose life, and that permission was the greatest gift he ever received. He said he hopes you found peace as well, and that you never stopped building bridges." Leonard read the letter many times, each reading bringing new tears. He had built bridges, hundreds of them across 3 decades of engineering work. But none of them meant as much as the invisible bridge he had built that September morning in 1944, the bridge between enemies that had allowed 217 men to return to their families. Leonard Hartwell passed away in 1992, at the age of 73, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. But the memorials that meant the most were the letters that arrived from around the world, from soldiers and officers who had heard his story and learned from his example. One letter came from Klaus Richter's grandson. "My grandfather always said that true victory is when everyone walks away alive. Your father understood that. My family is eternally grateful." His men thought he had lost it when he outlined his plan that foggy September morning. They thought he was marching to his capture when he walked unarmed toward German lines. They thought they were witnessing madness. Instead, they witnessed genius. The genius of a salesman's son from Ohio who understood human nature better than most, and who used that understanding to accomplish what superior force could not. 217 men surrendered that day. 217 families received their loved ones back, all because one young officer refused to accept that violence was the only solution and dared to try something different. That is the legacy of Leonard Hartwell. That is the lesson of Saint-Étienne du Bois. And that is why this story deserves to be remembered long after the fog has lifted and the echoes of that distant era have faded into history. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, Please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.